On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, we interview Andrew McNabb, author of a new book about Father Vincent McNabb, a contemporary of Chesterton and a famous thinker to many Chestertonians. Learn more about this fascinating man and about one man's spiritual journey with him. Hello and welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense. My name is Joe Grabowski. I'm the Vice President for Evangelization and Mission here at the Chesterton Society. And I am joined, as always, by my wonderful co-host, Grettelyn Darkey. Hi, Grettelyn.
Hi there, Joe.
And we're very honored today to have with us as our special guest the author of a new book about Father Vincent McNabb, who you've heard about on this podcast before, Andrew McNabb. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And just to start, Andrew, obviously your last name indicates that there is some relation there to the person with whom our listeners and viewers might be familiar, but they might not be familiar with you. So why don't you introduce yourself and also your relationship with Father McNabb?
Sure. Yes, Andrew McNabb. And Father Vincent McNabb was my great-granduncle. So he was the brother of my great-grandfather, Patrick. And so Patrick emigrated to the States and spawned a New World version of the McNabbs. And here I am, all these decades later. There was one other member of the 11, Richard, who emigrated to the States as well. But anyway, the rest are back in England and Ireland and so forth. And so here I am.
And the 11, that would be Father Vincent and his siblings. And that was, isn't there a title of his autobiography, alluding to that?
Yes, 11 Thank God, which is a beautiful book. It was Father Vincent wrote that later in his life, and the title is taken from his mother, what she would say when asked how many children that she had, and she would say 11 Thank God. And isn't that beautiful?
That's a really nice way to head off any snarky comments too.
It was probably a little more commonplace back in the day, but even today, even then, it was unusual for sure.
Good for her.
Indeed. So we are very happy at the Chesterton Society to be carrying this book, and we do have it available for purchase on our website. The title of the book is called Walking with Father Vincent, and Dale Ahlquist, our president, wrote the introduction to that. And if you're interested at any point during the interview today of procuring a copy of it, you can visit chesterton.org/McNabb. That's just chesterton.org/McNabb, or Googling it, it'll come up. But Andrew, I'd be interested in hearing kind of in main outline what this book is, what it's about, how you came to write it, and what readers can expect.
Sure. So the title of the book, as you mentioned, is Walking with Father Vincent. And so Father Vincent was very well known for a number of things in his life. One of them was walking. That may sound a little unusual, but really it's true. And some of those other things we'll get to in a minute. But it's the book is a biography mostly, but also I incorporate my own story throughout the narrative and that of my family going back generations. And because my own life has been greatly impacted by Father Vincent, and so this walking with is myself, and it's also others, and Chesterton as well, and so one of the reasons that I wrote the book is because of that profound influence that Father Vincent has had on my life. And I these days, all these years later, Father Vincent died in 1943, But all these years later, he is still known. We are here and we're talking about him today, and he's known particularly amongst the Chesterton universe, I would say. And anytime that we are introduced to somebody or we're telling somebody about someone else, we will talk about those things that are most obvious. And so people today who still know who he was, they know those kind of broad brush strokes of who he was. He was a distributist. He was a friend of Chesterton, a friend of Belloc. Maybe he was a good preacher. He was eccentric if you're going a little bit further down the line, and so forth. But he was really so much more than that. He was all of those things, but he was a very, very holy man who lived his life for the purpose of converting souls, of bringing Christ to people, to help them, and he had very great love for the poor, for the common man, and a lot of that is what I imparted or attempted to impart in the book, and also it's about family. Family was very important to him, because he understands what the family is, what the family should be, and this is really where he intersected with Chesterton and with Belloc, and in terms of the economic principle of distributism, and all of those things, those efforts of the Catholic land movement, because he saw the degradation of the family, that was going on at that time. He tried to do something about it, and so yeah, there are those kind of famous aspects of him as preaching and so forth. But again, there was so much more, and so anecdotally, I try to address a lot of that, and give a picture of who he was in his life, and anyway, yeah.
Yeah, well, you mentioned his he was sort of famous for walking, and that's kind of how he encountered a lot of the poor, isn't it? So, like, that's where that love. I mean, he had a love for the poor, but that he spent a lot of time with the poor
Yeah,
in England.
yeah, he did, because he was he was based for the last few decades of his life at St. Dominic's Priory, and it was in a poor area, and he would walk don't hold me to this, but the 4 or 5 miles down to Hyde Park to Speaker's Corner, and he couldn't help but walk through his neighborhood, and he wanted to do that, and he was beloved, he was very well known, but he cut a very interesting figure on his walks, because of what he wore. He wore his Dominican habit. And at that time, it was illegal to to um, to do so in England, but he didn't care. He did it anyway. And but his habit was also um, unusual in that he owned one and he did everything in it, and it was always seemingly less than clean, less than neat, and so he was remarkable in that he people sometimes didn't know who he was or what he was. I have a Franciscan friend, and he's currently, and when he wears his habit in the airport, people, are you a Jedi? Are you this? Are you that? So there were people who really didn't know who he was. He was characterized as this kind of medieval character, walking the streets, and it was part of his allure, actually, because he stood out so much, physically, but also in addition to that habit, there were his boots, and his boots were famous. Honestly, they were big, these big clod hopping boots, and he cut an interesting figure, and that helped because he preached with his whole body, with his mind, with his soul, with his physical appearance. Even in his death, he preached. And there's a famous story about about that very thing, about how several days before his funeral, he had all sorts of instructions about how he wanted to be taken, to his ultimate resting site, and he had all sorts of elaborate instructions. And he said, "Look, people are going to say that's just McNabb and his tomfoolery, and he's showing off and so forth." But it was like, but he said that's not it. I will preach even in death.
Mm,
And on his casket, he had written Latin, Lord, I love you.
mm.
And it was everything to him. Like his faith, he was very much like Saint Dominic, who spoke only to God or of God. And so that is how he lived his life. But getting back to the issue of the poor, it made sense that he would have a soft spot for the poor, because so did Christ. And that is where he drew his inspiration from. And also the fact that he grew up in that family with 11 children, in Portaferry, which is, I don't know, it's outside of Belfast and County Down in the north of Ireland. And his father was a master mariner, but he had all those mouths to feed. And so he knew what it was like to be poor. And so he came from that type of background. And one of the remarkable things about him, it wasn't just the poor; it was the common man. And for somebody who was as learned as he was, and he had a first-rate intellect. He had ultimately earned the Master of Sacred Theology, and he published 30 something books, and he was this renowned preacher, and he wrote, he was a Thomist and wrote all of this high theology and so forth. But one of the things that was often said about him is that, um, in his sermons, and particularly given certain audiences, he was always relatable. And so at Speaker's Corner, it was not filled with intellectuals. And so there were a lot of just, the common people who were there, and they loved how he talked to them, how they could understand what he was saying. And that for him was so important, and he remarked on that a lot.
Like a
Yeah,
Dominican, Fulton Sheen a little bit.
yeah, yeah, I guess
Yeah.
so. I guess so. Yeah,
It
yeah.
it strikes me that I've always had a soft spot for Father Vincent, and part of it is this similarity between it's almost like if you were to run the thought experiment of a what if Chesterton had been a religious, or Father Vincent had been a layman. They had so much in common, and it's no wonder that they ended up being um, very close associates and friends, and that they both had that love for the poor, that identification with the common man, and ability to relate to the common man while themselves being men of great genius and uncommon intellect, uh, right down to the disheveledness of an anachronism, as it were, of appearance. In Father McNabb's case, sort of by design of the rule of his order in a way, but in Chesterton's case, by the fact that the only way Francis could contrive to keep him looking semi-presentable was to wrap him in these sort of 19th century garments that would sort of hide the wrinkles and the untucked places. Um, but I wonder if you could for our readers illuminate a little bit more on the relationship, on the crossing of paths between Chesterton and Father in kind of their personal ways, because again, our listeners will be familiar with their ideas intersecting as members of the Distributus League and promoters of the Catholic land movement, but not necessarily. Um, I know there's one particular anecdote around Chesterton's death, but they cross paths in their personal lives, obviously, as well.
That's right. And um, and I don't hold myself up as an expert as it relates to their relationship. But he in fact first, like in that realm, he first had a relationship with Bellic, and so it was in the early, between 1911 1913 when those two first crossed paths. They were introduced, and right away there was a connection between them. And and again, I'm not an expert on Bellic either, but one of the interesting things that I have read was, Bellic was a very another very brilliant man, and a very kind of outspoken man, a very um, I don't confrontational probably wouldn't be the right way to put it, but he was very forthright in his opinion and so forth. And it was always remarked that he was very kind of muted around Father Vincent, because intimidation wouldn't be the right way, but it was but like his holiness combined with his intellect kind of
Mhm.
tamed Belloc, if you will, in a way. And that's how I read it. I don't want to mischaracterize things, because people in the Belloc universe may say no, that's not actually true. But
No,
anyway,
I've seen the same. Yeah, that there was this kind of
yeah.
deference. Yeah.
Yeah, and which is wonderful. And I'll speak a little bit about Chesterton's view in that realm as well. But Father Vincent was also very good friends with Cecil Chesterton, and I think that is it. So I think it went from, the Bellet to Cecil Chesterton to GK basically. And so, Cecil of course died much too early. But Father Vincent and Cecil and Cecil's wife were very, very close, and
Mm.
Mhm.
Father was devastated on his passing, but he kept up the relationship with Cecil's wife. And so, because from not being an expert, from my understanding, it was Cecil was really the strong man, if you will. It was very early, but the strong man, if you will, ideas wise, behind the Lamb, behind distributism. And had he lived, he would have been much more prominent and associated with that movement as well. And so I think that Father Vincent was greatly influenced during the teens, 19 teens. Towards this thinking, as things were happening in the world, post-industrial revolution, the World War I, and communism coming into play. All this confluence of things, was the fodder for all of these great minds to come together and say, okay, something is not right here. And their joint efforts to right the wrongs that were going on is what led to this alliance. And so, um, it was very important, this relationship that Father Vincent had and Chesterton had, specifically because they gave credence to each other, I think, in a way. It was very good having, for Chesterton to have Father Vincent, because here is this Dominican friar who is also carrying the mantle here. And for Father Vincent to have someone like Chesterton, as an intellectual and as a well-known man, to also be carrying that. And so it was a mutually beneficial relationship. It wasn't,
Mhm.
it wasn't necessarily thought of, oh, we're going to, capitalize on each other's, relative fame. And but it happened that way. And so it was very fortuitous for them. So.
Yeah, I've often suspected, and I don't know that anybody has really run this theory to ground, but when Chesterton comes to write St. Thomas Aquinas, there is the story that it's at the insistence kind of his publisher, because talk about fortuitous or serendipitous or providential, that Father McNabb comes around at a time where after the pontificate of Leo the 13th, there is this sort of reawakening of uh, and revitalization of Thomism, kind of in the popular consciousness amongst lay Catholics. And Chesterton, of course, you mentioned Cecil pre. He predates Chesterton Gilbert's entrance into the church, so he would have naturally been discipled by Father Vincent. But it strikes me that whereas the biography of Francis, that's obvious. That's Chesterton himself says Francis was always there with him. He always admired St. Francis from a young age. But the biography on St. Thomas Aquinas kind of comes out of nowhere. And I've often wondered or suspected that it's the influence of knowing this great Dominican Thomist thinker, and that is one of the things that spurs Chesterton to become more deeply read in Thomas Aquinas and end up writing that fantastic work on Thomas Aquinas.
There's also sort of the legend around the Dumox, Chesterton's book on St. Thomas, that he just sort of flipped through the Summa and then wrote the book. And of course, probably didn't have it
Right.
quite
Yeah,
that
so we,
way.
yeah, I don't know. That would be impressive, but I don't know. Maybe it's because they physically resembled each other. At least from what we know.
Yeah.
Right.
One never knows. But yeah, I mean, Father Vincent was, yes, he was a Thomist, and one of the things, one of his um, favorite things to do was to teach a weekly class on the
Mm.
Summa. And for over 20 years, this met weekly, and he only missed like 5 times. It
Ah,
was so dear to him. His students were so dear to him that he would, and, he was so busy, Father Vincent. He did so much every day of his life. But he was frequently away, giving retreats and so on. He would arrange his retreat schedule so that he could come back into town, and so that he wouldn't miss his class. And his class was filled with um, all sorts of unusual people. Again, common people to very learned people, to non-Catholics, to people who were just visiting and they wanted to attend one of these classes because they had heard about it, and so I'm sure that made an impression on GK, and
Yeah. Might have
yeah.
been one of the major unheralded sources for that book. And it strikes me too, the way you describe that, it's so you definitely see the work of the Holy Spirit in this, because it the description of those classes and their attendance and what I've known about sort of the social milieu in which Father Vincent moved, it's very reminiscent of what Peter Maurin comes over to America and starts doing with Dorothy Day and the founding of the Catholic Worker, and those weekly seminars in the houses of hospitality, where the whole idea was for the people who were there for need of a soup kitchen, and then academic professors in need of disabusing them of communism,
Mm.
um, mingling together and having lectures and sharing ideas and spiritual workshops. Just it's wow, what a time it would have been to be alive.
yeah,
Um,
I think so. And one of the Um, and indeed, Peter Maurin, he introduced Dorothy Day to Father Vincent
Mm.
in his work, and in is her book The Long Loneliness, maybe her most famous book. But she mentions Father Vincent in that book, and she mentions his influence on
Mm.
her, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, when we talk about at that time in this, and, the ideas that were floating about, and when I think of Father Vincent, when a lot of people think of Father Vincent, they think of his street preaching, of his engagement every week at Speaker's Corner. And it was there that he really shined. And it's certainly one of the things that he's best known for. But what is so interesting to me about that, and Speaker's Corner, it still exists. I don't think it's quite as prominent in the intellectual sphere as it perhaps was then. But what's interesting to me in doing a lot of the research for the book is the ability in this public forum to for ideas to be exchanged and to be debated. And it was largely civil. Okay, there were
Hmm.
certainly, you had to have a tough skin for sure, but people, they listened and they engaged. And unlike our current times, when our forums are more electronic, and which lends itself to less civility, if you will. One of the great things that inspired me was about this exchange of ideas. And in fact, and probably many of your listeners may be familiar with this book, but a source that I drew heavily on was a book called The Saint in Hyde Park, written by E.A. Siderman. And Siderman was a Jew who was at Speaker's Corner every week himself, and he debated oftentimes hotly with Father Vincent over the decades. And they grew to know each other so well and love each other. Indeed, this mutual respect between them was really something. So much so that Siderman wrote this book, A Saint in Hyde Park. And so he is referring to Father Vincent, of course, as being that saint. And what was so great about the book is that this man, he had, he never converted, but he had such respect for what Father Vincent had to say that the book itself, there's no editorializing. It's just, this is what Father
Hmm.
Vincent said, basically. And it's a very interesting and anecdotal book that's very, very worthwhile to understand what it was like at Speaker's Corner as well. So.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm, neat. Well, being that you had a personal connection, I would love to hear more about how, your connection with Father Vincent as your great uncle and how that's influenced you and how that has influenced your journey and your writing of this book.
Yeah, it's a really great question. Thank you for asking it, because it's a really important one for me, personally. And I will go back actually to Father Vincent's mother. And there is a very brief story about her that says basically everything you need to know. So as a very young woman, she must have been in her late teens. She emigrated to New York, and she was a seamstress by training. And she immediately found success there. She was very, very capable. She found work in a shop. And she had this. She was a first-rate seamstress, first of all, but second of all, she had an ability to mimic um, the latest fashions coming from Paris. And so she was
Mm,
able to do. She didn't have to go to Paris to see it. She would see it once, and then she would be able to do that. So she saved her shop owner, a great deal of money this way. But she was so good and so capable that she was within short order elevated to the top of the line. And she was even asked to be a partner in the firm. And so she had offers for marriage from different people. And this is all within a short period of time. But one day, on her knees in prayer, a light came to her. And this is told by Father Vincent in 11 Thank God. A light came to her, and she knew that she had to return to Ireland to save her soul. Okay,
mm,
so what did she do? Of course, she returned to Ireland. And so, what was so interesting about this is that she had found what the American dream. Nobody did that. Nobody who had left those circumstances, found success, found the American dream, chucked it and returned. But that is exactly what she did. So You know, her, you can imagine the impact that that had on her future husband, James McNabb, and then on the family coming down through the generations. So, what good is it for you to gain the whole world and lose your soul? And she,
Mm.
you know, she went back into this, you know, less than favorable situation materially, anyway. And so, you know, it's that depth of spirituality that influenced his family and then has cascaded generations, which is why it's so important. You know, the concept of family is so important, and carrying on traditions is so important, and carrying on the faith is so important. And so I see myself as an heir to Anne Shields McNabb's, you know, great decision there on her knees in New York, on the cusp of really kind of having it all. And so that has impacted me greatly. And you know, just in terms of Father Vincent himself, I have just always felt a connection from the time I was young to him. I mean, you know, when I was younger, um, you know, when you're not able to fully kind of understand things, but you know, I'd know that, oh, here's this famous priest in my family, and there's someone named Chesterton, and you know, so forth. But then it was really, I can tell you, in 1996, the special edition of the Chesterton Review came out. It was the Father Vincent McNabb issue, and probably many of your many of your listeners here would know of that. But it was a special issue, and I bought that, and I was living in New York at the time, you know, still relatively young, and that was really my emergence into him and into his life, and it's kind of stayed with me. And I, you know, I just there's just so much about his life and his idealism that struck me. And you know, I myself am a lay Dominican. He inspired, you know, 7 Dominican vocations,
Mm.
you know, in the McNabb family and counting, you know. And so I'm just the latest as a lay Dominican, but his life has greatly appealed to me. His depth of spirituality, his asceticism, which is another thing that he's very well known for, having, you know, slept on the floor of his cell for, you know, for decades, and everything that he wrote was on his knees, and you know, just his own deprivations and so forth. You know, it was, there's so much to him and to his life that extends beyond the boundaries of what most people know about him today, in that kind of economic realm or in the Catholic land movement. And
And yet it's so enlightening to know these details because that explains why he was so into those movements because they were really for the poor, you know. That's something that I think we can forget about is that people at that time were really looking for solutions and a lot of people were turning to communism or capitalism or and then this movement came forward that like this is what the church says will work. Let's try it, and it was really a solution to help the poor. So that's a beautiful insight.
it was
Also,
the yep, go ahead.
oh yeah, I was just going to say it strikes me too that he was so, I think, why he's been so powerful for me, as a, you know, reader of him over the years and admirer, is that it all resolved back into the realm of the spiritual. He didn't have this sort of modern mindset of, you know, that there's secular and your religious or that you divide them. You leave your work at the door of the church and vice versa. That it was all integrated in a very forward looking way, in a way that I think pre prefigures the call, or the reemphasis of the call to universal holiness coming out of the Second Vatican Council. And it comes from figures like his mother. It comes from, he's not, I mean, you called it idealism, and that's true, but it's what Chesterton would kind of call practical idealism, that you need your ideal because that fixes the point on the map that you're headed towards. And so the advice, the radicality of advice that he gives, is actually just the most practical advice. If we really take the Lord at his word, if we really believe that these are the stakes of these decisions that we make in our lives, and if our soul is what at stake, uh, then what wouldn't you do? And it's just a mistake so many modern readers think make, I think, approaching Father McNabb, but also the other distributists, that, well, that's economics, you could take it or leave it. And like, no, their ultimate purpose here is the salvation of souls and the
Mhm.
sanctification of the world. That's why they're so on fire about this, because they think that they were given a mandate, a commission from the gospel to preach this as part of the good news.
Mm.
So sorry, I'm on my own
No,
soapbox
it's
here.
listen, it's okay, but listen, it's also okay to yes, he was uncompromising in this, um, and there is a great deal of idealism rooted in distributism. Now we're calling localism, right? And so yes, it's for people who recognize and understand the ultimate good. The ultimate good is the disposition of your soul. And so if that, as you say, is truth, then why wouldn't you spend every ounce of your being to ensure that? And so that is what he and that is what Chesterton and others tried to do, to influence people in that direction. And what they did is they recognized that the environment that people were living in was not conducive to that.
Hmm.
Okay, and that's why they were doing that. He saw, flee to the fields because what you're coming into is Babylonian, right? And so,
Mhm.
it makes it, so that one must exhibit, heroic virtue in order to just live a regular kind of good life. And one of his things, he was very ahead of the curve as it related to birth control and abortion because he saw these folks coming in from the land and cramming into these tiny little flats. And he
Mm.
said, okay, well, you can't fit a family of 11 children in this 2-room flat. So what are you going to do? You're
Mhm.
either going to have an abortion or you're going to contracept. And so at that time, we think of that as a very modern problem. And it wasn't all that long ago, but people don't realize that he was at the forefront of the efforts against these things, which I'm very proud of. So,
And it's funny because, you can't fit 11 kids into a two-bedroom flat in the city, but you kind of can in the country because you can send them outside. I have personally known a family of farmers, and they have 10 children, and, they're all grown now, but they had a room for the boys and a room for the girls, and then they just spent the majority of their lives out working, and uh and it worked. I mean, they just and they're all still Catholic, which is also kind of amazing in its own way. So um yeah, it's a truly profound insight for sure.
Hmm.
Mm.
Well, I think one lingering question for me, or similarity not discussed yet, is you spoke of the saint in Hyde Park, that this biography gets written of him, and what a beautiful testimony to, um, of kind of an intellectual opponent, not a religionist, but yet recognizing him as a saint. It reminded me instantaneously of the famous remark of H.G. Wells about G.K. Uh, Wells said, "I don't believe in an afterlife or a heaven, um, but if I ever do get to heaven, I believe it will be in no small part due to having known G.K. Chesterton."
Mm.
And um, our listeners, viewers will know, members of the Chesterton Society, that we are actively pursuing and hope for a cause for Chesterton's canonization to be opened. But it has been said before that perhaps Father McNabb is worthy of his own. Perhaps you'd like to speak to that. I don't know if anything is underway amongst the Dominican order or what it would take, but what are your thoughts on that subject?
so my thoughts begin with God Himself because He knows who is a saint and who should be a saint, acknowledged as such in this world, and we can have our opinions on that. And my opinion is that he was certainly, if not a saint, he was saintly, and many people in his time considered him as such. Chesterton was one of them,
Mhm.
for sure. And there's a quote in the book around that. And one of the things that, and there was an effort. So Father Vincent died in 1943. There was an effort shortly after his death in this regard, and I will say that that some within the order were kind of pushing for it, hoping for it. There was a book again, and this something that I drew heavily on, written by a fellow Dominican who knew him, which is basically the biography, the standard biography for Father Vincent. And so it was written in the 1950s, and it was a very good time for that to be written because so many people were still alive who
Mm,
knew who knew him, and so lots of testimonials and so forth, including my great grandfather. The book is in fact dedicated to my great grandfather because he lived to the age of 90. So he only died 8 years before I was born, which is something I hold very, very, very dear. But one of the things I think that initially worked against Father Vincent was he could be polarizing because he was perceived to be, because he was dramatic, he was seen to be eccentric. And don't forget where he was doing his preaching was in England, right? And so where manners are certainly held in high regard. And here was this Irishman, this fiery Irishman, and but he was eccentric in we had talked about in his dress, in his bearing, in his holiness, but also in his mannerisms. And he would, if he thought that he had offended someone, he would get down and he would kiss their feet and beg their forgiveness. And there were very many instances of his authenticity being questioned. And so it might have been too soon in the immediate aftermath
mm,
of his death for him to be fully considered. But these decades later, we're at basically 80 years now. I'm hoping that the conversation will at least be be brought up again. And there are others who would like to see that happen. I just heard from a man in Belfast, an old fella in Belfast who is on his own, just fella who's very much wants this, and all sorts of other people. So I'm hoping that the book will at least begin to address that. And only God knows, if this should happen, of course. But that's a Dominican order thing as well. And so we'll see where this goes. So I just ask for prayers in that regard for Chesterton and for Father Vincent, because one of the reasons why people become sainted is to give inspiration and example and notoriety to their lives so that people can be inspired by that.
mm,
Mhm.
Okay, and so one of the things that Dale said in the introduction is that he's done a lot of work to bring Chesterton to to the public consciousness, and he says in there that it's time for Father Vincent to achieve the same in his
mm.
in his own way. And so
Yeah.
my book is one small part of this, and anyway, we'll see where it goes, but.
Well, it'd be great to have some more fiery Irish saints. I would appreciate that. So,
Amen. Yeah, I'm personally very convinced. I had the blessing of an opportunity to visit the name just flew out of my head. The cemetery where he is buried along with his confreres. Is it Kensal Green? Or yeah, there's another one in the north of London that I sometimes think I'm thinking of the wrong one, but yeah, it's very very unremarkable grave as is fitting for the life of a Dominican, right, with the vow of poverty. But it was very moving to me to be able to visit there. I visited there with our chaplain, Father Howe, and we said a prayer at the graveside there, and I was able to touch my rosary down to the earth where
mm,
Father is buried. So the same rosary I had touched to Chesterton's grave earlier in the weeks, and Tolkien's. So it's quite a literary rosary.
I'll say,
Yeah,
wow,
but
wonderful, wonderful.
I'll ask you for just closing thoughts. I want to remind the listeners and viewers that if you want a copy of this book, Walking with Father Vincent, if you'd like to walk with Father Vincent and learn not just about his ideas, but really how getting to know him as a historical figure, as a figure who is alive in the democracy of the dead and can help with your own faith and intellectual life, visit chesterton.org/McNabb. That link will be in the show notes, as well as a link to Andrew's website. But with that, Andrew, any closing thoughts, kind of last takeaways for our viewers and listeners?
Really, I thank you for the opportunity here today. It's a great blessing for me to um, um, to have written this book, to because it's been on my soul for a while, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak about Father Vincent and what he means to me, and what he meant for others as well, including certainly Chesterton, and what he can mean for more people today, because he was prescient, and he saw a lot of our current problems. He saw them coming decades and decades ago. And so, then there are remedies in there, and what he had to say at the time. And so we can all draw strength from that. So
Amen. Well, thank you once again for taking the time to be with us.
thank you.
And Grettelyn, thank you as always.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And for Uncommon Sense, I'm Joe Grabowski. Thank you, our viewers, listeners, for tuning in. Make sure to give us that like, subscribe, hit the bell notification if you're watching on YouTube so that you get notified. Write us a 5-star review. Really do like the video, like the podcast. That tells the robots, the algorithms, that this is stuff people like, and they suggest it to other people, and we can grow our community. Anything you can do to invite another listener into this great conversation that we're having would be very much appreciated, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Until next time, God bless.